Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. Ginni Rometty is with me today. In 2012, she became the 9th CEO of IBM, and by the time she retired as executive chair in 2020, she had spent nearly 40 years with one of America's most iconic companies. During her tenure, among the many other accolades that she received, she was named to Bloomberg's 50 most influential people in the world and to Fortune's 50 most powerful women in business, ranking #1 on that list in both from 2012 to 2014. Today, among other things, she sits on the board of JP Morgan Chase, as well as the board of trustees of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and Northwestern University, her alma mater. She's also the co-chair of 110, along with Ken Frazier, the former CEO and chairman of Merck. And she is the author of a new book, Good Power, Leading Positive Change in Our Lives, Work, and World, out now from Harvard Business School Press, and it's a Wall Street Journal bestseller. Ginni is also a senior advisor to Teneo, and I'm delighted to have her back on this program. So welcome, Ginni.
Thank you, Kevin. That's a very nice introduction.
First of all, congratulations on the book, and I will be the first to admit that I generally approach business autobiographies with a little bit of trepidation, but I have to say I found this a really interesting and enjoyable read, and not just because of your compelling personal history and personal story, but because Good Power is more than a title. It's a concept. And it's not so much about empowerment, though that is in there as well, but the power that we, both individually and collectively, have to influence outcomes, big and small. And I think it's a perfect week to be doing this because Teneo, along with many other companies in America, are starting their intern programs this week. So all of these new young people looking to start their careers are listening in. So I guess I'd like to start just with, it's a little bit of an untraditional autobiography because of this concept. Maybe you can describe for the audience a little bit of why you took the approach you did when you decided to write this book and what good power means.
Okay, so first I have to tell you, I have the same view as you do about most business autobiographies, which is very ironic that I would find myself then writing one. And so I struggled with this, and many people said, you've had this very interesting career, you referred to part of it, and then coupled with what my own personal journey has been. And they said, you've got so many lessons. So I struggled with whether to write a book. And how I finally came around to it was, really looking back on my life and the journey, the lessons I learned. And I said, could I be in service? I mean, you said all these interns, could somebody read this and I hope take away something that would be of value to them? If yes, then I'd write a book. And that's what took me down this sort of road that said, what did I learn the most about during my tenure and actually my life? And it ended up being this idea that you could do really tough things, but do them in what I called a good way. And it sort of landed like in the moment that felt so appropriate for right now, because there's so many examples of bad power out there. And sometimes people give up that you can actually get hard stuff done, and certainly on the political front. And so the idea of good power, again, revisionist history, I have to tell you, is when I looked back, I said, gee, what I learned was that big problems could be solved if you used, think of this as doing it respectfully, not with fear. And if you did not divide people, instead you love tension and try to bridge it. And last, celebrate progress, not perfection, because perfection polarizes people. And so those are kind of some silver threads, again, that I learned over time from other great people that I felt were kind of timeless lessons. And the book is just stories of lessons, good and bad, that I learned over time. But that I felt like right now, I want people to feel really inspired that they can solve big problems. You don't feel that in the beginning, but as time, your power does grow in scope and potency.
So I want to unpack some of that, but I want to just pick up on something you just said, because naturally, as you point out, the point of this is that it's relevant for everyone, whether they're starting out of their career or whether they're at the height of their career. But naturally, when you're reading a book like this, because you're a leader yourself, we tend to think of our other leaders, corporate, political, and otherwise. And when you think about that, are there whether they would define good power in the same way you do, but in terms of the principles you're espousing, do you
Yeah.
look at a lot of other corporate leaders today, or even political leaders, although I think it may be tough in some instances, where you know what, that person is really living that kind of leadership ethos?
Yeah, I do. I look across, but I'm really careful in the book. It's broken into three pieces: the power of me, we, and us. And I spend a lot of time on non-business people in the book. And I'd even ask anybody listening to your and my discussion today to think about, who do they see when they close their eyes and they think about who really impacted their life. And it's why I focus a fair amount on it. And like I was raised by really strong women, as an example. And when you think back to your beginnings, I suspect it's true for you too, you will now say, wow, if I really think hard enough about it, what I am today has a lot to do with what I learned back then. And my great grandma came here from, she was the last one alive from her family in Belarus during the World War, worked third shift cleaning bathrooms in the Wrigley building, never spoke English. My grandma made handmade lampshades. That's how she would support us. Both had great tragedies, husbands who died early multiple times. That sounds odd. That sounds like they did something. They didn't, but just tragedies of the moment. And and then my father abandoned us, and with no money, no food, no home. And yet I would learn from all of them, and I would celebrate them as people that had power when they had nothing else. It's because my grandma worked third shift that we would have US savings bonds to one day have a car. It's because my great grandma saved money, I'd have clothes. It's because my mom eventually got a little bit of school, would get us off of financial aid. So I feel like they had power, good power, when they had nothing else. And I really think that's a really important beginning for most of us to start with, is understanding, power is not associated with your title or your job. Yet I do think, to your real question, I think there are lots of good examples out there. You don't have to look far, Kevin. People we know, I think Ed Bastian at Delta is a great example. Tommy Mahalovic at Cleveland Clinic. There are really good examples out there. And I think more and more today there are, to be honest with you. I do tend to find them more in business than I find them across a political landscape, I have to say.
I have to say, reading the book, that the stories about the three generations of women who came before you is a really compelling element of the book. But it's not so, it was obviously a tough upbringing and a tough youth for you. But the book is not all dark. There's a lot of levity in there. And one of the funny things you do talk about that stuck with me was the savings bond to buy the car. And your first car sounded like it was a real piece of junk.
Yeah.
But it was funny that you cruised around in that. Anyway,
Yep.
I mentioned at the outset the interns starting this week, and it always, one of the conversations I always have with young people is to remind them that when I got out of school, Teneo as a company didn't exist. My profession, running the geopolitics, there was no profession. I started out on Wall Street. You're not going to necessarily, you can't plan out the entire path at the very outset. And as I think about some of the elements of your story, you didn't set off to Northwestern, to become a computer engineer, right? I mean, if I remember correctly, there was originally a thought of going to potentially medical school. But when you got there in 1975, the year that Microsoft was founded, the year before Apple was founded, obviously there was something going on in technology and in our world. So I'm wondering, what clicked for you that got you down that path?
Yeah. And I got to make a comment. Your point about, no, the book is not dark at all. And in fact, I start on some of those stories for a really valuable lesson for people, which is that what all those women taught me, A, hard work pays off. B, that don't let anyone else define you. Only you define who you are. My father abandoning our family did not define my mom as a victim. She did not let that happen. I mean, because to this day, I had to define my company. I mean, it's a long-term lesson that you always define who you are. Don't let someone else do it. You guys are in this business, and you know what happens when companies or people let that narrative get away from them and someone else does it, right? So I just backtrack. Okay, now to your point, for those listening about, how does life unfold and the kind of jobs, what I would say is one thing is that it's funny. I just did a graduation speech, a commencement speech at a university, and I was sort of quizzing my husband, and I said, "Well, what would you say to the graduates as a lesson?" And he said, "You know what I'd say? God, why don't more people just let life unfold? Why do you feel every moment has to have a plan to it? And that if they did, they may be surprised where it took them." So to your point, I end up at Northwestern because I can't afford a school, and it's an expensive school, but it's kind of timely with the Supreme Court decision coming down. They believed they should be able to give everyone a fair playing field. And so they admit you first on your academics, and then if you could get in, they'd find a way to get you financial aid. So that's how I got into Northwestern. Right. Need blind. And so, it's an important concept about what equality and equity means out there. And so when I did start to be medical school, because I felt it was a very noble profession. And of all classes to struggle, I struggled in human reproduction. Don't ask me why. I really struggled with that one in organic.
Very rare in college students, but yeah.
Very rare. I laugh about it to this day. But what I did like, and I think it's like great advice, why I wish more people would go into engineering. I was in engineering school. To me, engineering teaches you how to solve problems. You don't need to necessarily be an electrical engineer. I was an electrical engineer. I only practiced that for a short time. The idea was, though, I felt like I learned how to solve any kind of problem. And so to me, STEM fields are a launch pad to almost any kind of job out there. And so in that time, this compulsion I had to want to always know how something worked, to me, I never wanted to memorize anything. I had a brother who's got a photographic memory. I don't. So to me, the only way I could ever get to an answer was reconstruct it, which is very logical. And therefore, with computer science just coming out at that time, right? Big boxes of cards, logic, if then, assembler language, that would be what I would learn first. But it fell right down that alley of logical problem solving. And to me, that is the earliest days of computer. I mean, the earliest days are things that counted. The next generation was if then, and now you've got things that learn, right? I mean, if I really grossly simplify.
Right, exactly. Now, one of the other themes that recurs throughout, especially the early part of the book, and you're talking about your own progress professionally and whatnot, though, is loyalty, I would say. And I'm not talking about blind loyalty here. But for instance, your very first job coming out of college was with General Motors. And General Motors had provided you with summer internships. They helped you with your tuition, et cetera. And though you had no particular love or interest for cars, you went with them because they had helped you along the way, and you felt compelled to accept their offer after school. Talk about loyalty in that respect.
Yeah, this is a good question because you read every newspaper every other day's got a topic about a new workforce and their beliefs and loyalty and the like. So I felt I learned a really valuable lesson, again, one that is timeless. So why did I work for GM? GM did give me a scholarship that paid for 2 years at Northwestern, extreme, and no strings attached. Now, no one does that anymore. But at that time, they wanted to have more women and more underserved people in the company. And this was one way to bring them in early. So I felt an obligation that I said, gee, they gave me a chance. I should give them a chance. So I'm not sure that that's loyalty, right? That's the idea that, look, I feel like that's doing what's right? That's a responsibility. They gave me a chance. I need to give them a chance, right? And so I went there, and to your point, and I say this, Mary Barr is my good friend now, and I say, you love cars, but to me, I learned that difference at a young age, the difference between a job and a career. You got to have some love for a career. A job, I mean, I could go to work, do a great job. I could do it 7 to 3. I could, easy. And I looked around and there were people that they really love cars. And I'm thinking, this isn't right. This doesn't feel right to me, right? This isn't about just spending 8 hours a day somewhere. And that's what really, my husband is the one that said, you love the technology so much. Why aren't you working for a company like IBM? And he said, let me call a friend whose dad works there. I mean, that was, in those days, that was that simple. And he said, go to an interview. And I left. But the lesson was, boy, here I'm 21 years old, and I can see the difference between a job and a career. Kevin, you love what you do, right? It's a career. And so sometimes. It doesn't mean but it doesn't mean you and I get to do things we love every minute of the day, right? And I try to explain that to people. we're lucky when we're doing the love part 30-40% of the time, right? And then there's lots of other things that go with it. But that's to me the lesson. And that's less about loyalty. I think it's more about a responsibility that you have to do what is right.
So, you've already brought up this extraordinary part of the early part of the book about your great grandmother, your grandmother, and your mother, and the stories around it, and how much character building that did that for you in discussing their losses, but also the resilience that all three of those women had. But one of the other elements that strikes me is the talk of the men in your life. You talked about your brother. You talked about your husband, Mark, of course, who I had the pleasure of spending some time with the other evening here in New York. But also in your professional life, that men who, as you write, hired for character as well as talent, and were interested in the growth of their employees. And you reference this time and time and time again. During your period at IBM. And I need to remind the audience, how rare it is today. I mean, you spent 30 years at IBM before becoming CEO. Those of us at Teneo are familiar with, obviously, our chairwoman, Ursula Burns, who started as an intern at Xerox before she ultimately, that's a rarity in today's world. But talk about that culture at IBM. I mean, did you get lucky? You
No.
seem to also make in other words, the IBM was just the right place in that respect. You seem to make the point that it's important who you work for as much as where you go to work, frankly.
Yeah, look, again, you're still sort of like in this beginning part of the book when I talk about the power of each of us individually, and we make our choices where we choose to work. I think there are two important things. Why does someone like Ursula stay where she did so long, or I did? It's not because I did the same thing. I mean, my God, parts of IBM didn't even exist that exist today that were then. It's because of two things: a value-based company, values-based decisions, and this idea that you're constantly getting to learn something new. And I think that's true today. So when you talk about why people, I was just reading an article, why do people leave jobs? I think the number was 77% of people felt to get a career bump or change, they had to change employers. That's what I never felt. I could get all that different experience within one place. So and I feel like companies earn the right to keep you with every move. And I would tell people that when they join us, I'd say, look, I earn the right to keep you with each job. You can make a decision each time to move somewhere else. And so that and the values-based part. And I think with so many new companies that have sprung up, I think where they've struggled is on the values part. Part of it's time. They just don't have time to deeply root values. And so therefore decisions sometimes are made one way, then another. They're not grounded in a belief in something, right? And so they feel a little bit like, well, wait, what do you stand for? And so that's to me why I was there longer. And so when you say people that taught me things, I have to tell you, my first couple managers were actually women, to be honest, even back in that day. This is the 80s now. They were women. But when I was taught values, I think, one man I worked for when I first became a manager, a story I share in there is that I had a man working for me who was, I guess in this language, you'd say, telling very dirty off-color jokes. And it was offending people. They came to me, some of the women came to me and said they were very offended. Okay, this is 1980, mid-80s. And I went to my boss, I'm a brand new manager, and I said, what do I do here? He was my top performer. And he said, oh, this is unequivocal. You tell him it stops immediately or you fire him. And that's to me what I mean about values. It's like you're taught things that are about what is right, what is wrong, and that everyone needs to feel comfortable at work, which is why 40 years later, I would fight for things like the bathroom bill, about people being comfortable at work. And, he taught me that in just through what it is that he did, that is what it meant. My very first appraisal was things like, I was not appraised on what I learned. I got appraised on what my team learned and was developed. I got ranked on, did I have a diverse team? This is the 80s. And so it's in your mind already that this is about, a diverse team is a great team, not compulsory. It's like, it's theirs because that's how you get the best outcome. So what I think people early on, and you say, why do you stay? That's the values part. And then the part about like getting to do so many different jobs. I mean, I went not just professionally, but I was in technology, but then I went into consulting. I mean, I did many different professions. So that's why, in my view, if you work for a company that's values-based and gives you lots of learning, you're going to end up staying there.
Yeah. And just staying on this concept, though, for 1 second of the mentor issue. And by the way, another kind of interesting anecdote in the book was that when you were appointed CEO that day, many of your first calls were to those people, men and women alike, who had mentored you along the way. So I thought that was very telling.
Yeah,
In some
but
cases before yeah.
Kevin, that gets to my point about this is, I think, a misconception people have about mentors. A lot of people feel, hey, I need a mentor or a sponsor.
Right.
And
Right.
I never believed that, because what I found was, if I would just ask people questions and take interest in them, they would take interest in me. And most of what I wanted to watch and see was what I could learn from them. And you end up with this like mosaic of mentors and sponsorship. And to me, I try to convey that to people to say, please don't get fixated on, gee, I didn't have one person to pull me or whatever. And so that idea of a mosaic, and that it's about what you give, and then in time, it's what you get in return. And so that's what I would really like people, that's what I try to get people to take away. And it would pervade my whole life, by the way, of my CEO world. I think when you talk to people that know me, I always felt clients were about what I could give first. And then over time, I had a trust that I would get something in return.
If I could just digress for 1 second, though, on your story to this concept. I mean, does it concern you as you look around? And I know, you're on, as I said at the top, you're on the board of JP Morgan, and I know Jamie Dimon and management team have struggled with this as every other company, including our own, has, right? Which is this concept of getting people, particularly that sort of mid and younger level, into the office in this post-pandemic era, because all of these professions in their own way are apprenticeships. You learn how to deal with negative situations and so on by watching how seasoned practitioners deal with the positives and the negatives. So are you concerned that we're losing something in this?
Yeah, but I think you answered the question in how you framed it, because there's that old saying, the WIFI, what's in it for me, or something. There was an old acronym like that. And to me, this is about apprenticing and networking is what you missed. And I don't know how to do that just remotely, because you don't catch the offhanded points. You don't catch it on the side. You don't have serendipity. You don't have surprise. And that learning sort of like at the foot of someone else, or however they say, the knee, it does not happen as easily. And so that's, to me, if you forget about what the company needs, if you only think about it for a selfish perspective, what you need, to me, it's one of the most important things to get across. Like, I feel I apprenticed, and I often took a step back even in apprentice to learn something new over time. And that's what I wish people would focus more on. And it is, I guess it's as well about innovation. But even if you just go back to how people like typically first start with themselves as a decision and say, it's in your interest actually, because of these things. And certainly, now that's not true for every profession though, Kevin. So I do have to make a differentiation. There are some, and I think it has to be married with another point, flexibility. Because I do think in this day and age, if you really push people on what do they want on return, when an employee's like, I don't want to return to the office, you'll hear about, it's the traffic, it's the amount of travel I do, it's I have a child that needs this or that. They need flexibility. I mean, I can't solve if you have to stay home all day. That's a different issue. But if you focused more on how do I give people flex, and then maybe there's an answer to that problem.
Sure. And so I want to, you just made this point that you had in fact taken sort of steps back at one point. I believe when you made the move from General Motors to IBM, you took a step back in pay, and it was a risk. Even though IBM was an established company, the PC was a new thing. Who knew what was going to happen? And a recurring line in your book is that growth and comfort never coexist, right? And so, and I'm wondering, you made that big change from GM to IBM, big risk. 1987, you then made your move to your first serious management position. 1991, you go into consulting. You were 34 years old, and now you're no longer selling the product. Now you're selling you. to the client. In 1997, you go to run global insurance and then ultimately become CEO. Talk about taking these chances and risks. How do you, the decision-making process that was going through your mind, and how you took on these challenges?
Yeah. So, well, let me ask you a question first. You've had a lot of job changes. So how do you take on risk? What do you think about? And I'll answer you then, but I'm
Yeah,
curious.
I mean, I'm supposed to be the one asking the questions here, Jim.
I
But to be
know.
honest with you, I mean, I no. Look, I mean, it's very similar, right? I mean, I started out on Wall Street, and I found myself going down a pathway of interest, which was that politics mattered to corporate and market outcomes. And but we didn't really focus on that in as scientific a way as we approach, say, economics or market fundamentals or market strategy and the like. And so there was another way. It wasn't apparent to me in my early years how to channel that interest. And then only later, as things changed, did that become clear. And then you have to kind of, but I also left a 90,000 person organization to go to a 10-person organization, that was a big risk, as I was just starting a family.
Yeah. Did you toss and turn over that decision?
Absolutely, I did. Absolutely, I did. And I took a
Yeah.
pay cut to do it.
Yeah.
But I've never looked back.
So, okay. Now, so what you described, and that's one way to take risk, is you had great conviction about what you believed, and you had a belief this was a way to do it. And in my early, all those just sort of changes you referenced, oh boy, I would toss and turn over them. I wasn't as confident as you. I would, oh my goodness, I can remember waking up in the nights thinking, oh, do I do this? This could be the end. What if this doesn't work out? What are we going to do? This kind of thing. And sort of my infamous story that, really sort of brought all this to a culmination was the one, time would go on. I did go into consulting, but oh my goodness, I tossed and turned because it was an unproven path for IBM, right? So I thought, well, this is it. I'm not doing the normal thing. I'm going another way. This could be the end. I would then take on I was doing a big job at the time, and my boss was getting promoted, and he said, I think you should have my job. And I'm like, oh, I am not ready. So my source of fear was typically I wasn't ready, was my, I wasn't confident. And he said, no, go to the interview. And I went to the interview, got offered the job. And I said to the man, let me go home and talk to my husband about it first. And he kind of looked at me and he's like, okay. I went home. I talked to Mark. Mark says to me, he listens to me go on, and he says one thing. He says, do you think a man would have answered the offer that way? And I said, no. Now, Mark's point was not just a gender point. His point was, he goes, look, I know you. 6 months, you're going to have licked it. You'll be ready for the next thing. Why do you do this to yourself? And his point was, with all these risks come learning. And that crystallized that saying, growth and comfort never coexist. And the idea, if you can really, really internalize that, and it would happen for me in steps like this, that I would start to say, whoa, the more nervous I get, the more I'm going to learn and the better I will be. So I then started to associate risk with learning and goodness. And if you can do that, you will be surprised. There's very little you'll be afraid to go do. You'll feel nervous about getting ready for it, but you'll know, oh man, when I finish this, boop, I've laddered up one more skill that I have to have. And so that's how I got very comfortable with finally taking risk, was that I no longer associated it with fear. I associated it with growth. And that's the famous, it was almost the name of the book, Growth and Comfort Never Coexist.
And that's the personal element, though. Was there also a concern on your part, like, say, for instance, when the consulting business was starting to get ramped up, that was, given the entire storied history of IBM, this was going in a non-core direction. And I don't know if you were already thinking about the C-suite at that point, but like, if I go down that path, am I no longer going to be on the path to the C-suite?
I did, but you know what? And this would be another piece of recommendation I would make to lots of people. But what I did say was I was learning a market relevant skill. So I thought, well, if it doesn't work out here, there's other places outside. And I think that's when you've worked in one place for a company for a long time, you have to be careful that the thing you become proficient at is valued on the outside world, not just the inside. And part of what kind of pushed me into it was I thought to myself, gee, I'm getting really good at how to get stuff done in IBM, but that has no value outside of IBM. So, this being a consultant is absolutely externally market facing. Like you said, I can remember one time in the old days, you had voicemail. I had changed my, and I had to sell work, had to sell myself. I changed my password. I still remember it to, I need a job. I'm like, how to sell a job, I need a job. So I think that idea of always remember, hey, am I taking on a job I'm learning that the market values? And if you are, then you're in good shape.
Just pivoting here a little bit, you've alluded to this already, and I think it would be, no, it won't be a surprise to the readers of the book, considering when you started your career, that in the 1980s, clearly the sort of the Mad Men era wasn't completely over, and you've already alluded to some of the off-color jokes that you witnessed and endured, and actually in the book you get into some really painful experiences on comments made to you about your appearance, and that you ought to adjust things and so on and so forth. But underlying that all, you say, you write that on the whole, you felt respected and taken seriously at IBM, and your steady promotions, I guess, would confirm that, to be sure. But is that something that was about IBM? Was it something about you and your own resilience and your own I'm going to see through all of this fog of war and I'm going to keep my eye on everything you've just been describing, or what?
That's a good question. And I actually don't think I think it's both of those, if I really reflect on it. On one hand, here I am at a company that I just started, like I said, does have deep values. So did GM, by the way. The companies I've worked for happen to have been like that. And so on the large, they were meritocracies. And so, yes, you always find exceptions, but on the large. And so that point. The second part, though, would be what we do to ourselves, right? And how we ourselves are either confident or are able to, sort of how we internalize critics. And so I do write a fair amount about that, because I do think as a woman in really senior role, and I would say to other new women becoming CEO, I would say, look, what you do, it will be magnified and it will be personalized. And there will be good that comes with that, and there will be bad that comes with that. Take advantage of the good, but there will be the bad. And so you've got to learn how to deal with the bad. And I had to learn how to deal with it. So, there'd be critics. And I learned to, I listen to critics for what I can actually learn from them, but I can't let them define me, right? So whatever they might say, I'm like, well, I kind of agree with that one piece. The rest, I do not, and I move on. You have to learn, I think, to compartmentalize things. And so, and I would say that's true to any leader, to be resilient, right? You take problems, get them, going to get a plan, put it on a box, put it on a shelf, come back, check on it, but it can't sit in your head all the time because you've got so many things to deal with. So I think how I dealt with it had more to do with that. And one other thing, which I would have said at the beginning, I should have. Everyone might not agree with this, by the way, Kevin. In my early days, being the only woman in places. So here I am in college, in engineering, I am for sure the only woman in these courses. And I would think whenever I would raise my hand, oh man, if I have the wrong answer, they are going to remember I had the wrong answer, okay? And so it would begin this cycle of studying and preparing. And you know me well enough, I'm like a compulsive preparer. And it would be, the knowledge would first be a shield against that, but it would eventually lead to a lot of confidence, because almost any room I walked in, I was more prepared than anybody else. So that is the other way. So to me, preparation and knowledge was, as you said, well, you must have been promoted for your merits, right? I mean, that was the best way to deal with that issue. One more comment. You didn't ask it, but one more comment on that subject of, I spent many years not wanting to be a woman role model. Okay, because of everything you're talking about. I would say, hey, just recognize me for what I did. Please don't talk about that. And at one point, again, one of those watershed moments, you remember, I put it in the book. I'm in Australia giving a presentation. I think it's fantastic, by the way, on financial services. Man comes up to me, and I'm thinking he's going to ask me something about my brilliance, about my talk. And instead, what he says to me is, I wish my daughter could have been here. And I say to myself, okay, none of us, you too, by the way, are a role model in many ways. Like, this isn't really about me. That's a pretty selfish thought. You reach a certain level now, it's a responsibility to be a role model to other people and take that seriously, because they cannot be what they cannot see. I mean, Ursula talks about that. You cannot be what you cannot see. And so if people think they could be CEO too, I mean, I have to embrace that I'm a role model for that. And that part of being a woman, I would come to then really embrace more and talk about it very openly, because I did find it was so helpful. Now, interesting point, writing a book. It is amazing to me. So now how many years later are we since that day I felt that I entered the workforce? It's now 45 years later. And I watched with my book. I was at a big book thing yesterday and signing things. And it's interesting how many men asked me to address the book to their wife or their daughter. And isn't that interesting? And even some of my very best friends will say, oh, I want to get this for all the women in my company to read. And on one hand, that's great. And on the other hand, I look at them and I say, not the men? 45 years has transpired, right? So we still have work to do.
Yeah, clearly. Interesting. So you become CEO. And at that point, you sort of pivot the book from the power of me to the power of we. And you're starting to talk about now this necessity of followership, and you need force multiplication to see your ideas and your leadership through to actualization. And so, you talk a lot about building a network and learning to delegate. You've already mentioned having to move away from the concept of perfectionism. Perfectionism is a weird word, right? Your customers really appreciate it, probably drives your colleagues crazy, right? But there's also a notion that you, Ginni, you can't fix everything. You don't know the answer to everything. Find somebody who can, put them to work doing this. So talk about when you got into the CEO position, how you then actualize this concept of team, of delegation, of followership that you write so much about.
Yeah, I do. I mean, in to shorten on the middle of the book, I mean, trust me, like I said when we started our talk, I wasn't like, oh, I live a good power my whole life. This was like a revisionist history, I repeat, point that when I looked back, I said, what are the lessons I could share if I was doing it over again, right? Or what I learned from other people. And, followership is as much about, I talk about being in service of something and building belief. Followership comes along a lot from being authentic, is what I found and what I witnessed. And when you help people build belief, you have to speak to their head and their heart. Typically in a business environment, many people speak to their head, not to their heart. It's uncomfortable. And that is what I would learn to do. And it would mean you'd have to admit when you were wrong. I mean, I had to admit to the workforce after, it was clear. I mean, we were up against a wall. We were not prepared for another decade in front of us, another century. And so speed was of the essence, right? You mentioned all the companies well, there were those that began when I started the company. And even then when I became CEO, this was just the beginning of, Google, Amazon. Well, they'd been going for a while, but they were really starting to grow. And so at that point, speed was of the essence, right? And I would tell people, come on, we got to go faster. We got to go faster. And at some point, I really would apologize to the workforce because after 2 years, things weren't going faster. And I said to myself, okay, people do not wake up in the morning and go, hey, let's be slow today. They don't. There's something that we are doing, like how work gets done. And I would learn that focusing as much on how work got done was as important as what we built and what we did. In fact, it influenced it a lot. And so, it's like asking somebody to run a marathon in hiking boots. It's not fair. And I would tell them this wasn't fair. So we got to get rid of layers. We got to put in agile design thinking, things that everybody does today. But back then, at a scale of hundreds of thousands, were different. And so that idea, that head and heart together to both go toward it, I think is in one way how you build, is a big way of how you build followership.
You say in the book something that really struck me because I've worked for companies both big and small, and we all see people that we do not want to leave the firm, right? And sometimes that's fine. That's just the natural order of things. But you have a line in your book where you say, pay people competitively before they ask. And it
Yeah.
always strikes me that people oftentimes, the only way they price themselves in the marketplace is they go out and they get another job offer and they come back, and that's the negotiating tactic in a sense to get paid more. And in fact, in order to match that, now we got to pay 100% of what the competing offer is. We probably could have kept them at, whatever, 75% of X, and we would have built goodwill in doing so. And now we might lose that person because actually, even if we match, there's a bad taste left in their mouth, or maybe they actually found something really interesting to do. But it doesn't. It seems to be something that that afflicts every company
Yeah.
On that front.
Yeah, on boards I serve on, I'm aggressive about this topic about really, because sometimes people say, well, we just gave that person something. I'm like, yeah, but they're not even at the 50th median. I mean, 50 percentile. What do and this is one of your best people. I don't get it. And so it's rooted in a few things. I mean, it's interesting that when I would go into these professions along the way that were market facing, all of a sudden I'd be meeting other people and I knew what they were being paid on the outside. And I could see my goodness, I'm doing the same job. And so it should be paid that way. So it would start this belief in my mind. And as I hired more and more external people, I always say, the best thing is if someone never picks up a call from a headhunter. You don't ever want them to answer. You want them to be too busy to answer that call and too happy to want to take the time to do it.
Right.
So the only way that happens is if you're proactive. And I would always rather, and this would be over time, I would learn this and be able to do this. I would much rather give someone an award, a promotion, a raise when they really earned it versus on some other kind of false schedule. Because to me, boy, it is like an ounce of prevention for a whole pound of trouble that you can take. Now, to do it means you have to believe strongly in differentiation. The companies that kind of sort of treat everybody the same, this is really hard to do at. But if you believe top performers should be rewarded more than, the average, than the lower performers, and you really believe in differentiation, this is quite easy to do with a budget, right? We all live in budgets. Right. And so I really felt that idea of paying people competitively, you use the word loyalty. I just believe it engenders this commitment if you do that, right? If you do this before, because once you've had to ask, you feel like, not everyone does, but a lot of people I know feel like, oh, it's kind of a creepy feeling. Like I had to do this. Like you don't see me for what I'm worth.
Right.
And that's kind of the sort of the bee's nest I never wanted to open if I could avoid it.
Right. And when that person feels that, then they are going to pick up that call when it comes.
Happens all the time.
So, as with every other CEO I've ever known or spoken to, along with all the accolades, of course, comes the criticisms from the street, from the media, et cetera, et cetera. And, IBM, over 110 years old, has obviously reinvented itself many times. Before you got there, reinvented itself while you were there. And when you were in charge, new existential threats were coming from all over the place, right? You talk about the cloud, you talk about the rise of mobility and the rise of data and social media, et cetera. So how did, amid all of the backseat drivers out there, when you're in the CEO seat, do you remain, focused? How do you reinvent without losing the core identity of the firm? How do you know what has to change versus what must endure, as you say? And by the way, just as a reminder to everybody, the responsibility that came with sitting in that seat: 300,000 employees, 170 countries you were operating in, $100 billion in revenue, 1 million plus shareholders, a $100 billion pension fund. You quote the former American Express CEO, Ken Chenault, who spoke at an IBM event, I believe, and he said the role of a leader is to define reality and give hope. And I think he was actually channeling Napoleon when he said that, but that's what he said. So, how do you maintain that North Star and not deviate from it?
Yeah, well, you perfectly described the situation, and it was, in your word, existential. So, and that was different because in the past, there might be one technology trend. There were 4 or 5 at once now. I mean, we all feel this now. This is all history. But,
Yeah.
and at the moment, it was existential. IBM was the oldest kid on the block and the only other kid on the block. Everybody else was new, basically. And so, you've got to, my first words would be, you got to have conviction about what you're doing is right. And we didn't, I mean, look, it was very difficult because I would have to divest of $10 billion of business when the world was yelling for growth, right? And my mom would say, oh my God, my nephew would say, Auntie, they're so mean sometimes on television. And I would tell him, and I told my mom, just turn it off for now. I'll tell you when to turn it back on. Because I really strongly believed I was like a steward for a moment. And my job was to build a foundation, as hard as it would be, that the company could grow again one day. And it would mean not just the portfolio, it would mean how we did work. And the hardest thing turned out to be the skills, right? 2 in 10 people had the skills for the future. So it was a big skill building environment that had to happen. And so that conviction and a board that supports you, right? Because they know you're doing something that's hard and it's not going to be applauded when everyone else is growing on the outside. Now, we had a very strong dividend. There are a lot of people that invest in IBM. It's way over being a dividend aristocrat at this point. And so, but it is conviction, right? It was the number one point, a supportive board with conviction and a belief that, it doesn't mean everything we did turned out right. Big bets, some were right, some were a little early. I wouldn't call them wrong, they were early. And you have to pivot. But that idea that you just stay convicted and realize that you are a steward for a longer period, and a responsible steward. And I think that is hard to do, Kevin, in this world with public markets. So I was lucky to have a large shareholder base that was retail. It doesn't churn. They are owners, not renters. Others have pure renters, right? They're coming in and out, et cetera. So I wouldn't call it a luxury at time because of our size. It needed that time, but that's what would happen and the first ingredient of that was having conviction to do it. Now, personal is resilience, right? Because, you can't help but be impacted by, we talked about it a minute ago, right? And that's when I'd go back and say the 2 biggest things somebody needs to do hard stuff in the resilience category. It's why I wrote a whole chapter on resilience. It's relationships and it's your own attitude are the 2 biggest things that do that.
Now, we just have a few minutes left, so I want to get to the power of us in a second. But while I can't not ask you this question, because I think for a lot of us, our very first exposure to artificial intelligence outside of the movies was probably Watson. And we all remember, I believe you were CEO at the time, we all remember when Watson won on Jeopardy, as an example. But we are in a new world of AI that is just exploding right now. And I'm wondering what your kind of big picture thoughts are on that, both in terms of the opportunity, but also the risks. A lot of pioneers in this business have kind of signed on to some very, public and private, government and business need to get their acts together on this early. But what's your view on this?
Yeah, this is more about action than talking. Okay, I feel this way about a lot of things, which we'll talk about the next topic too. But I feel the same way about AI as I did a decade ago, and I felt strongly. I felt it should be there to augment what we all do, not replace us. And those of us that created, have some control over that, by the way. Okay, so don't abdicate that control, and that it not only there is to augment, but that people have got to trust it. And so today, when I look at where we're at, so why didn't it take off a decade ago as fast? Well, because it already could do medicine better than a doctor, by the way, back then even. Hard to train. Okay, so there was an economic reason why not as fast. And the second reason I saw was the issue of trust. You don't trust a black box. Henry Kissinger's book on the age of AI, he says, history shows if people don't understand something, they fear it or they revolt. And we're on this precipice now. And the difference today is it's unveiled. Netflix takes 3.5 years to get to 1 million people. This thing gets to 1 million people in 5 days, and it's at 150 million now. Okay, yeah. And it's easy. However, I write a whole section on being a responsible steward is you better focus as much on the downside of something as you do its upside. You would have to say social media, we focused all on its upside. We knew its downside was there and didn't do anything. So you can't stop AI right now. It's out. So forget that. You're not going to be able to slow it down. I've never been able to slow a trend down. But what I do think now is every one of us has to focus on the trust side of it. So you get a choice in your company, how you use it, how you train it, how you explain it, what you do with it. Don't abdicate that. And yes, there should be precision regulation. But I think now the issue, if people get in their minds that this is going to be a trust issue, not a technology issue. And we're going to see it because the issue of disinformation is so high, right? So governments pummeling it with bad data. We have an election coming up. So people's, opinions get pushed one way or another incorrectly. This is going to be a kind of a reckoning that'll show, okay, it's one of its real underbellies are, and we've got to work really hard on that underbelly. And I think versus make it amorphous, everybody listening, you have a company, okay, pay attention. What did really train it? Are you explaining it to people? Don't let it out unless you do that. I know you feel this urge like, oh no, everyone's using it and it's so easy to interface. But the problem is it sounds so authoritative, people aren't going to think it's true. And it may not be. And just like today, if you follow a Google map, in the old days, you probably said, oh, it says this, and I look on a map and check it out. You just do it. You just blindly turn your car now. You put on autopilot. You can't, some of us will know enough to test those answers. Like my very first go around with chat, I asked, who is Mark Rometty? That's my husband, as you know. It told me all about what Mark did to run IBM. Okay, well, Mark didn't run IBM. Okay, well, he thinks he did, but he didn't run IBM. But I knew enough to ask the next question. Okay, so that's my point. This is going to be on each one of us. Don't make this an intergalactic problem about how we now deploy.
Good point. So that will be a whole separate conversation. We should probably unpack one of these. But I do want to just close on the power of us. Maybe we can focus this a little bit, because you have taken one of your major tenets, which is a skills-first approach to hiring people, to your co-chairing of this organization, 110. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about how these concepts all kind of together. But I know we talked about 110 the last time you were on here, and I'm just wondering if you could give a progress update on how things are going now that you're a few years in.
Yes, so close to 100 members, and we have hired and promoted over 100,000 people. So that's our progress update, but much more to do.
Right.
So to close this in a kind of a concise, kind of how this all comes together, we've kind of talked a lot about individuals as leaders, a lot about them leading people. And then I just want everyone to believe, because I witnessed it and feel like this is what happens. Because you go through those stages, you look back and you actually have the power to change tough problems in society. You do. And I only use skills first as my example. Yours might be different. But in this case, look, I came across all of this because I needed employees. And in part of that, I would find my way and learn that I had over-credentialed 50% of my jobs to require a college degree when they did not require one. And I would then learn that 65% of Americans don't have a college degree. 80% of Black Americans don't have a college degree. If we wonder why democracy is at risk, if people felt democracy gave them a better future, they'll vote for it. When they don't see a better future, they won't. A large part of this country and many developed countries don't see a brighter future. To me, there's a very simple answer to this, and it is skills first, meaning how do we help people get good jobs that can sustain a family? And the philosophy being that, please, where you start should not determine where you end. I witnessed that with my mom. She had no education past high school. She found a way to get a little skill. She got us off of food stamps and welfare and got us in a home, and look where we all ended up. Now, that idea, my mom had aptitude, she didn't have access. That is so true around this world, that aptitude is pretty even. God spreads that evenly. Access, opportunity, not so much. And if you can just remove one big false barrier that has crept up in so many economies like ours, and it happened for good reasons, the GI Bill, go to college, and I'm not saying college is bad. I am vice chair of a university. It's not bad. However, we may not all start there. And there are a lot of great things that can be done you have to have a skill. Could be an associate degree, could be an EMT, medical certificate, lots of things to start. And I hope I started with doing it for my company. Then when I say the power of us, I realized, okay, don't make it an IBM program. Try to make it something that everyone could do it their own way, the power of us. And then when you are the power of us, it's like any system thinking problem. Lots of levers can help this thing. There's policy, supply, demand. You can work on, companies' own cultures. If you work on all of them, I learned that with obviously technology, so systems thinking, you can make really hard problems digestible. And that's why I end on that topic, to give people, I feel we've started a movement. You hear or you read about it. I'm going to do another interview with the Wall Street Journal later on this topic of skills first. Hire people for their skills, not just their degree. And I think if you do, you're going to have a more diverse workforce. My data proves more diverse, more loyal, performs just as well, and more retentive. I don't really see anything wrong with that equation. So that's a good spot to end.
Book is Good Power by Ginni Rometty. She became CEO of IBM. She was only the 12th woman to become CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And frankly, in 2018 is the first year that the number of women CEOs in the Fortune 500 outnumbered the number of men CEOs named John. Just goes to show how much more there is to go on this front. But Ginni, it's a great book. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much for joining me today. Hope you'll come back soon. But for now, all the best. And for everyone else, thank you for joining. Until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a good day.